should set the stage. Just talk about the book, obviously, because people are just getting it. Talk about what the book's about. Just give a couple minutes of synopsis.
Sure. It's basically it's two stories. It's the story of black soldiers in World War II and their families, and soldiers who had to deal with racism at home and fighting the crack German army in Europe. And I interweave their stories with the stories of a Jewish community in Eastern Poland, told through a young Jewish boy who is caught up in the Holocaust and is almost killed in a string of concentration camps. And essentially that's what the story is.
So first off, what inspired you to write it? What inspired you to put aside all those years of reporting, and what about this story made you want to pull up and actually just tell a different kind of story a different way?
Well, I started out, I was interested in writing a nonfiction book on this black tank battalion that was had a very exemplary record during World War II, the 761st Tank Battalion. And they weren't quite as well known as, say, the Tuskegee Airmen, but they had some notoriety. And in fact, there were several nonfiction histories already written about them, including one called Brothers in Arms, written by basketball legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And I decided that when I saw that, I don't think I could make mine different. So I decided I'd do fiction. And at first that was kind of...
You decided you could not make it different?
I didn't see how I could make it different. So I decided I would make it fiction. And I had, the idea was sort of daunting about, writing fiction, because after all, as I like to say, the only experience I had in fiction writing was on my expense accounts.
Now you tell me.
Yeah, right. So I was playing around with this idea, and then in November of 2020, then President-elect Joe Biden named Anthony Blinken as his Secretary of State. And at the press conference announcing Blinken's nomination, Blinken got up and told the story about his stepfather, a man by the name of Samuel Pizer, who as a young boy in Poland was caught up in the Holocaust and was in a series of concentration camps. And towards the end of the war, almost at the end of the war, when he was almost dead, he was rescued by the 761st Tank Battalion. And I was watching this and a light bulb went off. And I said, that's going to be my novel.
You were watching it on television.
I was watching it on television. And I said, that's going to be my novel. So I'm going to basically use that as an inspiration. I'm not doing a retelling of Pizer's story, but it's a fictionalized, the characters, as they like to say, any resemblance to true characters is purely coincidental. But that was the structure of the book, and that's how I came to write it.
So it's unimaginable to me, personally, to be able to write fiction. So you're sitting at the typewriter or the computer, whichever you chose, and you're constructing characters out of whole cloth instead of out of a notebook full. Let's talk about just that process.
Well, I have to say, at the beginning, it was very difficult. The idea of, constructing characters and constructing scenes and constructing dialogue out of whole cloth. It was, I had spent 45 years making sure that every word I wrote, or every word I edited, or every word I was associated with was true, was accurate, could stand scrutiny. But I have to tell you, after a while, it was just so liberating to be able to just make shit up. So, like for example, I for a while was really struggling with dialogue, and how would I write dialogue? And then one day I had an epiphany, and I said to myself, Steve, just think of it as a news story where you can fabricate the quotes. Because I mean, how many times, Dean, when you're writing a story, you're interviewing somebody, and you just say to yourself, "Gee, I wish he had said that." Now you can make him say anything you want.
I get it. What? So I'll ask you. So you have white characters and black characters.
I did.
So talk about the difference in writing them. I mean, and was it hard to put yourself in the shoes of characters who were very different from you? How did you do that?
Yeah, it really was. But this is, I think, where journalism came in. I mean, one of the things that I have to say about myself in the book that I'm the most proudest of is that this book is full of characters who are not like me, right? It's got military people. I've never been in the Army with the military. It has a lot of female characters. I'm obviously not female. It's got Jewish characters. I'm not Jewish. It's got one of the, not major characters, but a very important character is a gay black soldier. I'm not gay. It's got black characters. My wife likes to call me the whitest black man in America. So, right, that's another story. But anyhow. So, but the fact of the matter is, as a journalist, I had to put myself in other people's shoes all the time. That's what, I think a good journalist does. And so it was kind of daunting, but in the end, I just sort of tried to think of, okay, how would somebody think of whatever's going on in whatever situation? And it turned out to be not as difficult as I thought it would be.
I have friends who write fiction who've asked me to read their fiction because I read a lot of fiction. And whenever I make suggestions, I realize I'm making newspaper suggestions.
Right.
I'm making suggestions like, well, the character on page, which means they reject them all. Because I'm making suggestions as if I'm editing a newspaper story, which is like, why do you know that? And
right.
I can't, that's why it's hard for me to picture the words on the page not feeling like newspaper paragraphs. How do you go from spending, you said 40 years?
45.
45 years, like writing about the same as me, writing newspaper paragraphs, newspaper quotes, newspaper structure to doing something very different. And how different did it feel?
Well, it does feel different, but what helps and what gave me comfort is that I take what I call the spine of truth, right? Things that were actually true, things that actually happened, things that, would have to be scrutinized and have to, people would say, oh yeah, that's right. There's at this particular date, such and such happened. And I take that spine of truth and then I just can add different muscles, different tendons, different just parts of the body to it. So the journalism part is to figure out where those spines of truth fit in the telling of the story. And once you figure that out, then putting the rest of the body parts to the spine actually becomes fun.
Is there any of you in the book? Is there a character who I was once in a conversation with a bunch of fiction writers, and they all said, if you look closely, there's a piece of them in the book. There's a character, there's an anecdote, there's a scene, there's a character. Is there any of you in the book?
Oh, there's a lot, actually. Yeah, it's I sort of put dollops of my family's story and my family and characters from my family throughout the book.
So tell about your family's story.
Well, my family is Bayesian. I'm third generation, basically. My grandparents, both my parents on my father's side and my grandfather on my mother's side were all from Barbados. Right. My father was born in Panama. But he came here as an infant, and it was a working class family, and my father was one who felt that his sons had to show responsibility, because I sort of wandered away from that.
When?
Well, it's funny. Here's an example of my story. I have two of my major characters are brothers, right? The oldest one is sort of the straight arrow, always follows the rules. Is very responsible. The younger one is sort of a rebel, right? Well, I have an older brother, Gil, and right after high school, he sort of followed the strict path that our parents sort of laid out. He went straight from undergrad to law school to starting his own law practice. Me, I dropped out of college after my freshman year, bummed around Europe for a couple of months, moved out to San Francisco, was a hippie. I was a hippie. Lived in a commune, you know.
Wow.
In fact, I always like to say, you know, you ever see these photos of these sort of gatherings like Woodstock? And it'd always be like one black guy in tie-dye jeans with a big fro, with a headband.
That was you?
Well, not necessarily actually me, but basically that was me.
Wow.
So then I finally came back and sort of straightened out a little bit and, you know, put myself through City College, driving a New York City taxi cab at night, and then fell into journalism. So anyhow, I had these two characters, and as I was writing, I called my brother up and I said, Gil, listen, I got an idea for these characters. Two brothers. The older one is sort of a straight arrow, does everything, you know, according to the rules. And the younger one's kind of a rebel. And he starts laughing. And he says, gee, I wonder where you got that from. There's lots of things like that. One of my major characters' name is Donna Knuckles. Well, my aunt's name was Alice Knuckles, right? I have a very, very minor character who just appears as a master sergeant in the Red Ball Express. And I gave him the name of J.C. Helms. Well, my father's name was Jonathan Chesterfield Holmes. So, you know, there's a lot of little dollops of my family throughout the book.
Was any of that painful to write? Is there anything what was the hardest thing about this book?
Well, the hardest thing wasn't writing. The hardest thing, you know, it's funny. A couple of years ago, I saw a piece in the Times about how difficult it is for first-time novelists to get their books published. And it basically featured this one woman who had gotten a book published and interviewed her and asked her what was the most difficult thing in the whole process. And she said, far and away, getting an agent, right? And that was the most difficult thing. It took me a year and a half until I finally found an agent who's sitting in the back. Larry, why don't you stand up and, you know, right? My agent, Larry Rosenblatt. Right. And gosh, I feel like President Trump, you know. Stand up, you know. Right.
Please.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Believe me, there's quite a bit of difference. So yeah, that was difficult. It took me about a year and a half, almost 2 years to get an agent.
Wow.
And yeah, that was the most difficult thing by far in the whole process.
So if you, it's my last question, then I'll invite others if they want to ask anything about you and your life, since obviously people haven't had a chance to read the book. What do you want people, I'll use the word Q-head, which is the
the Q-head. Oh God, I haven't heard that in a long time.
I know, that's what I did that. I want to see if you remember it.
You know what a Q-head is, people? It's when they have a piece in the Times and they write next to it analysis. That's a cue head. Don't ask me where it came. Where did it come from?
It comes from, I used to know, I don't remember. But it's
Yeah,
not,
okay.
So I'm not going to ask you in a newspaper way. I just wanted to test you, see if you remember that. What do you want people to take away from the book? What do you want people to read the book and think, I didn't know that, other than the actual existence of the unit and the existence of the story you described from Blinken? Like, what do you want people to take away from this book with?
A couple of things. And the existence of the unit is important. I just think that I want sort of a mass audience, a larger audience to understand, to realize the contribution of African Americans to the war effort. It's, I think if you talk to sort of the average person and ask them about that, they'll say, oh yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen, they'll know that. But they don't know about the 761st Tank Battalion, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Battalion, the 969th Field Artillery. These are all units that played really important roles in the fights. And the other thing I'd like people to come away with is two other things. Not only that these units were important, but their families were important. One of the things I'm sort of a World War II buff. I watch a lot of World War II movies, read a lot of World War II books. And one of the things I find is that there's a lot of, in a lot of these works, there's a lot of focus on the men who fight the battles. And there's very little focus on their families. Except for the adoring wife, but that's about it. All right. And I just, these guys who fought the battles came from families that had their own family dynamics. They had sibling rivalries, they had issues with, father-son issues, they had a bunch of stuff that all families have. But I just think that we have to remember that these heroes, and I believe they were heroes, also were members of the family. One last thing.
No, go ahead.
That I want people to take away from.
I have another question after. Go ahead.
And that is that the commonality of the struggles at that time and still today, but certainly at that time, between blacks and Jews. The commonality. It's very important. It's an issue. It's a feature that is often lost in contemporary discussions of racism and anti-Semitism. But there are two communities who essentially struggled against hate.
Why do you think that's lost in the net? Why is it because people don't read history, don't remember history? Why do you think why do you think that's lost?
I think that's right. I think people don't read history, don't remember history. And I think, unfortunately, that for too many black folks, when they think of Jews, they just sort of meld them into the general white population and don't think of it as a separate group that has its own history, and that its history is, at least in the fact that they had to struggle against hate, is very similar to ours.
Do you have another book in mind?
Well, I thought of writing a sequel, right? And it took me 5 years to go from idea to publication. I'm 77 years old, right? And 5 years means that I'll be in my 80s at this. So whenever I think of that, I think, I'm not going to do that. But I have to say, and one of the things that happened, I had a writing coach when I was doing this. Basically, he was just an editor, who I would send drafts to. And
who was somebody, obviously, who lived more in the world of fiction than you did.
Oh, yeah. John had written, I think, about maybe 5 or 6 published, mainly mystery novels. But he had said, oh, yeah, you got to write a sequel. And I told him, nah, I'm not interested. I don't really, don't have the time, don't have the energy. And he said, oh, okay. So then what he did was he said, look, you got to write an epilogue to your book, because people are going to want to have some sense of what happened to the characters. So I sat down one day and I wrote this epilogue, and I had a really good time writing it. All right, and I gave all these scenarios of all what happened to all these characters, and which I won't go into now. And then I sat back and I looked at it and said, this is an outline for the sequel.
So it sounds
I think
like
he
you're
did it
gonna
on
write a
purpose.
sequel. I was about to say you got tricked.
I think so. So I basically have a framework of the sequel. So I just have to, get up off my ass and do it.
I don't know if anybody in the audience wants to ask anything before we. Yes.
Hi. It's curious to me that the person who won a Pulitzer, who's a journalist, has such a hard time finding an agent. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
It's because it's fiction. Right?
It's fiction. There's a couple of things going on in the fiction market. First off, I'm not. It's when you're a first-time author in fiction. It's difficult, right? Unless you're a big name, a guy, somebody like Jake Tapper has written a number of pretty good novels. But he would have no problems getting an agent. Me, on the other hand, people either don't know me or certainly don't think of me as a fiction writer. Then the other thing that I think I had some difficulty with is that I was trying to sell a book in a market that was a difficult market. The fiction market, especially the Black fiction market, is dominated by women readers. All right? I've read in a number of places that about 85% of the people who buy fiction are women. And I come along with what looks like, at first blush, a book that won't appeal to women. It's a war story, it's violence and all this, I think it's more than that, and I'm hoping that it has universal appeal. But I had a hard time with that, and was told by a couple of agents who rejected me, said, we can't sell this book. One agent said, this book is too masculine, I can't sell it. So that was one of the things I was up against. I found an agent who believed in me, and we sold it, and we'll see how the public reacts to it.
There. Go ahead.
Go ahead,
I have
Amy.
a question, but first, just a follow-up on that, Steve. So I just texted my mom
Mm-hmm.
your picture of your book.
Yeah.
She says, "Oh, great, we're going to do this in our book club in December." So
Great.
your woman market.
Okay. Tell your mom thank you.
So writing a book, especially a big book like this, is much different than writing an article.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious, as a writer, what did you find most challenging about writing a book, or that really maybe caused you to exercise a certain writing muscle that you weren't used to because you normally are writing short form stories?
Well, let me answer the question another way, okay? When I first started this, I happened across an article that was called "Slaying the Dragon," right? And the dragon in this article is that inner voice that a lot of us, probably all of us, have of self-doubt, right? And mine was, the voice that says, "Who are you kidding?" Right? You're going to write a novel? Come on, right? And what the person who wrote this article said, what you have to do is every day you got to kill this dragon. So every day you gotta, you know, it could be in the morning, could be in the evening, could be any time, but every day you gotta do something to kill the dragon. You gotta write a sentence, you gotta write a paragraph, you gotta do a little bit more research, you gotta do something, to, you know, just to keep the dragon at bay. And when I found that when I did that, what happened was I built up momentum. And I don't know about other people's creative process, but I believe that a lot of it is all about building momentum. That, you know, for me, it's like, you know, you write a really good paragraph, and then all of a sudden it leads into another really good paragraph, and then another one. And I think sometimes it might be the same way with painters. You do one brushstroke, and that leads you to do another brushstroke, or music composer, you write one bar of music, and that leads you to the next bar of music. And pretty soon, voila, you know, you got it. So I just really did think that doing something, having enough discipline to do something just about every day. Now, believe me, I'm doing something every day, but pretty close. And that just, you know, enabled me to get this done.
One there, and then Janie.
I wanted to ask, how difficult is it?
I'm sorry, Lorraine, you got to speak up.
How difficult is it once you're in the writing process and you're writing, let's say, a very emotional scene, and then now it's time for dinner? How do you cut that off? How do you become Steve again?
Well, my wife Marie will tell you that a lot of times, you know, she'd say, you know, come on for dinner, and I just, you know, I was into writing, and I just said, screw that, and so she was very understanding sometimes, but yeah, sometimes you get emotional. There are scenes in the book that became very emotional to me, and I hope become emotional to the reader. I hope, you know, we'll have to find out. But yeah, you don't put your emotion aside. If you're writing something and it becomes really emotional, you stay with it. You stay with that emotion, because if, you know, you want to make sure that you get every ounce of that emotion onto the page, because, you know, hopefully then the reader will feel that same emotion, or at least some level of it.
Janie?
Steve, I have 2 questions.
One, no, I have 7 questions. One is, what other research did you do? And the second one is, you know, how to develop the context and understand, I don't know, the backgrounds of characters, or was it entirely coming out of your imagination? And secondly, this has been touched on, but I feel like you haven't kind of grappled with what I'm interested in, which is the conversion of oneself as a nonfiction writer, a journalist or whatever, to a fiction writer is more than just structure. It's also a whole way of building a story, you know, a way of interweaving certain, you know, where you place key events. All that is so different. And also, when I wrote my more personal book, someone who was working with my agent said, you have to forget everything you ever learned at the New York Times. And I'm just curious, did you have anything like that experience of, and even the language one uses, you know, the avoidance of, you know, if you're writing journalism on a regular basis, you tend to have, and you're under pressure, you tend to use certain language. But as a fiction writer, language is going to be so much more important in some ways. So how were you conscious of trying to shuck those, you know, bits of habit?
Well, those are a lot of questions, Jenny. Yeah, right. Let me answer it. Let me first answer it. One of the things that was difficult, one of the more difficult parts of the book, wasn't so much writing, but was organizing this book. I'm telling 2 stories and I'm weaving them So I go from one set of characters to another set of characters. I go from one community to another community, right? And I have to figure out, okay, which anecdote, which tale am I going to tell first, and then which one next? And I can't stay with one set of characters for too long. People, essentially, if I'm telling all these stories about these black characters, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody says, "So what happened to the Jews?" Right? So, I gotta, come back to them. And at the same time, what was helpful, but also so difficult, is that there was a structure, a time structure. Certain things happen at certain times. The Battle of the Bulge happened at a certain time. The liberation of some concentration camps happened at a certain time. My wife and I wandered around Europe for a couple of weeks. We went to a number of different places, former concentration camp sites, different places in France and Belgium where battles, both real and imagined in the book, take place, right? But they take place at a certain time period. And so I can't be too off on that, while at the same time weaving the stories together. So I think that's where the journalism writing came in. Because as you know, writing an article isn't about telling facts, it's about organizing your thoughts and organizing facts and organizing what you're writing. I think you'd agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Because a disorganized article will lose readers immediately, and so that's where the journalism came in addition to what I said before about putting yourself in other people's shoes. You talked about language. Language, I can't say I struggled with. I sometimes am afraid that people will say that, they'll read it and they'll say, oh, people didn't talk like this back in the 1940s. I tried as hard as I could to get my characters to talk like they talked in the 1940s. I did this by going back and watching old movies to hear, basically this old dialogue, what about them dames, right? And stuff like that. I think I got it, but it's an area that I'm sort of I have the most trepidation about when people read. But I also decided that I'm not going to worry about it too much, because I care, but I don't care. I mean, the important thing is to get the thoughts of these people out. If the language isn't just quite right, well, that's tough, right? Hopefully people will be forgiving. And what else? I think I answered 2 of your 42 questions. What did I miss?
You got it.
Oh, okay, cool.
So one more question.
What was it like writing the dirty parts?
I'm sorry, what was it like writing?
Writing the dirty parts.
The dirty parts. Well, the funny thing about writing the dirty parts, my wife said, your gay sex scenes are more interesting than your heterosexual sex scenes. I said, oh, really?
I would be tempted to stop right there.
I don't think I'll go any further than that.
Thank you all. So please buy the book. Thank you. And
Thank you.
congratulations.